A panel of scholars discusses the evolution of American liberal political philosophy through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. They concentrate on the ideologies of John Stuart Mill, David Hume, John Dewey, and Jane Addams. The discussion was part of a day-long symposium at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's about an hour.
So much of this summit is concerned with the intellectual history of progressivism and conservatism. Many of our speakers ask how the ideas and arguments of major political thinkers have made their way into the cultural conversation, have shaped political attitudes, and given rise to political action. Well, our mid-morning session is particularly exciting in this respect. The three historians before you, Claire Rydell-Arsenis, Peggy Vandenberg, and Judy Whips, are going to discuss how certain major intellectual figures of the long 18th, 19th, and indeed 20th centuries have affected, and in some cases may continue to affect, American political thought. I'll introduce our speakers alphabetically. Claire Rydell-Arsenis is a doctoral candidate in United States history and a Gabel Dissertation Prize Fellow at Stanford University. Her research, very well suited for this conversation, interrogates the transatlantic intellectual, political, and cultural exchange from the late 18th century through the Cold War. Today, she will discuss John Stuart Mill, Harriet Taylor Mill, and the coalescence of modern liberalism in America from the 18 to the 1970s, with particular attention paid to the middle of the 20th century. Peggy Vandenberg is an associate professor of philosophy at Grand Valley State University. Her teaching and research primarily concern the ethical theories of figures of the 18th century Scottish Enlightenment: Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, and Thomas Reid. This morning, she will examine the reception of David Hume's work in America, particularly by James Madison. Judy Whips is professor of liberal studies and philosophy at Grand Valley State University. Her main interests concern American philosophy, particularly the intersection of feminism and pragmatism, as well as the philosophy of education. The editor of the 4-volume set, Jane Addams' Writings on Peace, Professor Whips will discuss John Dewey, Jane Addams, and the development of progressive ideas about education. With that, I turn it over to our first presenter.
Wonderful. Good morning. Thank you, Joe. Let me begin by thanking the Hauenstein Center, along with its director and staff, for organizing this wonderful event and for inviting me to speak this morning. And thank you so much for being here, even at this still rather early hour. I should also maybe mention up front that today my talk is decidedly more historical than political, and perhaps is grounded more in the past than the present or the future. It's also about intellectuals who themselves were not politicians. Nevertheless, I hope it will provide some food for thought as we consider together the contours of our contemporary political debate, and landscapes, and how we might find some common ground. Broadly speaking, today I will look at the place of the 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill in the invention of an American political tradition in the 20th century, to show how this tradition is perhaps more complex and historically contingent than historians have sometimes allowed. In their struggle for the world, the communists have one great advantage over the West, and that is the power to generalize their position and their aims. They have their book, Das Kapital. The West, too, has its basic books, but it has forgotten how to read them. We have only the dimmest idea of where we came from. So wrote Life magazine in 1949, and its lament fell on eager ears. The year before, an official from the Truman administration sought help at Princeton University, for example, in the project of canonizing a liberal democratic political tradition. Graduate students in the politics department there were asked to respond to the official's prompt that, as he put it, the National Association of Manufacturers has spent thousands of dollars in an effort to prepare a primer embodying the essence of our political tradition, but without being able to produce anything. More specifically, these students were asked to supply a list of books to provide for an American, and by extension Western civilization, the equivalent of what Marx's Das Kapital had provided for the communists. But just what was this essence of an American political tradition in the 1940s and 1950s? One way to look at this question And to answer this question is to look at who or what came to constitute the tradition by turning, as my own larger work does, to the influence of the 17th century English philosopher John Locke and his second treatise. Another approach, and the one my talk today takes, is to look at a more ambiguous case, that of the 19th century English philosopher John Stuart Mill, whose status as a liberal fit for inclusion in a recognized American political tradition in the middle third of the 20th century was less clear. Mill, celebrated liberal as he was, an acclaimed author of the great On Liberty and Representative Government, was not Americanized in the middle third of the 20th century in the same way as his fellow English liberal, John Locke. Surely this American ambivalence about Mill bears some notice. Might it be because Mill, by the end of his life, had written favorably about socialism, and that at least some intellectuals after the Red Scare and during the deepening Cold War came to regard him as a fellow traveler? Indeed, a nuanced, complicated liberalism of the sort Mill provided was not what many American intellectuals inside a vital center wanted. As I will suggest today, however, an attitude had not always reigned. Between the 1910s and the 1930s, the threads of individualism, or liberalism understood as a deep concern for individualism, individuality, and the protection of the associated economic, civil, and political rights and freedoms thereof, and socialism, in some sense, an understanding of the privileging of society or community with specific methods of labor, production, and distribution to better accomplish social equality and economic equality. So individualism and socialism within the body of Mill's work represented for many integral, if complex, components of liberalism and even democracy itself. As such, the combination of the two threads in Mill's thought was the very symbol of the possibility of finding harmony between individual liberty and community well-being. Following the publication of John Dewey's work on liberalism and social action in 1935, however, many American intellectuals, in part as a reaction to Dewey's work itself, increasingly saw Mill shift away from a solid 19th century classical liberal vocabulary to a more open attitude and positive stance towards socialism as indicative of a fundamental and perhaps irresolvable conflict within liberalism and liberal democracy. No longer were Mill's ardent defenses of individual liberty and later in life socialistic tendencies two sides of the same coin. Rather, they came to illustrate for many, in clear terms, a chasm, a deep split in liberalism that could explain some of the ongoing and fundamental problems at the heart of American politics. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Mill's increasing tendency towards socialism over the course of his life was no secret. Mill himself, after all, had written about his evolving ideas in his own autobiography published in 1873. In 1924, Harold J. Lasky, the Marxist English political theorist, published a new edition of it after extensive research at the Columbia Libraries in New York City. Meanwhile, students in American colleges and universities learned of Mill's questionable status as a liberal in some detail. Undergraduates in Princeton Professor Lyman Atwater's class in the 1870s, for example, learned that, as he put it, Mill would substitute some form of communism for the present state of things. And nearly 50 years later, in the 1920s, these same students were still immersing themselves in a careful understanding of, as they took it, Mill's conversion from individualism to socialism. In these decades, around the turn of the 20th century, however, conversations about Mill's socialism often only underscored his centrality to liberalism. Many Americans not only confronted the tensions within Mill's thought, but embraced them as productive means of thinking about an ideology of individualism and American liberalism itself. Of primary concern to this group was unpacking for their readers the nuances of Mill's philosophy of individualism or individuality, and how Mill productively thought through the at times tenuous relationship between individual liberty and concern for the greater societal good. Writing for the Philosophical Review in the early 1920s, American philosopher and Cornell professor Frank Tilley, for instance, sought to, as he put it, examine the foundations upon which Mill's individualism rests, and to note the phases of his philosophy which seem to be out of harmony with it, and which so often point to new roads. Such a study, Tilly continued, may help us perhaps to strike the proper balance between the individual and society. Tilly's conclusion, in short, was that Mill's individualism and what many would see as a later-in-life move towards socialism were not incompatible, nor necessarily to be explained away, but rather were, as he put it, an opening of new roads of a possibility for American individualism itself. 3 years later, still in the 1920s, Charles Street, who was then an Episcopal student chaplain at the University of Chicago, also pointed to Mill as a solution to the problem of reconciling individualism with policies intended to improve the general welfare of Americans. Street argued that the best way to answer questions about the most fitting relationship between the individual and society, or the state, was for his fellow Americans to turn their attention to a careful study of none other than John Stuart Mill. In their writings, both Tilly and Street were echoing the likes of Bliss Perry's understanding of the relationship between individualism and fellowship, Herbert Crowley's understanding of constructive individualism, and Westall Woodbury Willoughby's call in 1914 from his position as president of the newly founded American Political Science Association to think seriously about a social component to individualism. Willoughby had declared that, although an American ought not accept socialist doctrines when it came to property, production, and labor, he must accept, as he put it, the socialist general theory that it is the proper province of the state to do whatever it can to secure the true interests of its people, unrestrained by any a priori limitations growing out of the essential nature of political authority. In other words, an individual's real interests could at times be best advocated for by the state itself. In the 1920s, as we saw with Street and Tilly, many American intellectuals would employ John Stuart Mill to explain these nuances of individualism and to point the way towards thinking about liberalism as a means for improving society as a whole. In some ways, this changed in the 1930s. Then concerns about Mill's socialism began to crystallize as his ideas increasingly came to be seen not as multiple reasonable lines of thought coalescing in the mind of a complex thinker, but as two diverging lines of thought that one must choose between. Two reviews of John Dewey's just published Liberalism and Social Action in the New York Times by journalists still remembered today, Charles Chamberlain and Henry Hazlitt, serve as telling examples of such a shift. Largely critical of Dewey's portrayal of liberalism as resembling more closely a socialistic scheme, Chamberlain proclaimed Dewey, as he put it, a radical democratic socialist. One point Chamberlain thought Dewey got right, however, was Dewey's depiction of the split within liberalism best dramatized in the life of John Stuart Mill. Chamberlain learned through reading Dewey that with Mill, quote, liberalism parted company with laissez-faire in England, leaving open the question of whether it had done or would do the same in the United States. Writing for the New York Times a month later, Henry Hazlitt finished his review of Liberalism and Social Action with a more rousing claim that, in effect, through unpacking in the career of Mill himself, liberalism develops an inner split. Mr. Dewey, Hazlitt concluded in outrage, winds up by telling us, in effect, that liberalism means socialism. These readings of Mill's philosophy set the backdrop for the Austrian economist Friedrich A. von Hayek's work on Mill in the 1940s and 1950s, which would secure in the minds of many Americans the precise nature of Mill's socialism and its origins. In 1951, after more than a decade of work, Hayek, a liberal perhaps in the classical sense, whose complex relationship to American political and economic thought, the historian Jennifer Burns, for example, has well documented, published with the University of Chicago Press the correspondence between Mill and his eventual wife, Harriet Taylor. The letters Hayek uncovered demonstrated Taylor's overwhelming influence on Mill's thinking about socialism from early 1849, as Mill worked on a new third edition of his latest work, Principles of Political Economy. These notes and letters, according to Hayek, were, as he put it, probably the most interesting and significant of all the newly discovered letters that he had found. Although he did not publish these letters until 1951, as early as 1940, Hayek had put pen to paper to offer his interpretation of Harriet Taylor's influence on Mill's works and life in a piece, J.S. Mill, Mrs. Taylor, and Socialism. Significant was Hayek's ability to show without a doubt that Mill's socialism was not a late-in-life phase, as has been thought maybe until this time, but a long-standing political persuasion that developed in earnest as early as 1849. Equally important was the attention Hayek gave to the influence of Harriet Taylor on Mill's move towards socialism. While Hayek himself was more suggestive than conclusive about the strength of Mill's liberalism and the extent of Harriet Taylor's socialism, reviewers of his work in the letters he published were not. Those who digested and disseminated Hayek's works from major American periodicals, ranging from the New Statesman to the New York Herald Tribune, were utterly sensationalist in their prose. The idea that Mill's trajectory towards socialism was, as one reviewer put it, a product of his following of the peculiar, though acknowledged brilliant philosophy of a frustrated, consumptive, socialistic suffragette, was wildly popular. Regardless of where one came down on the question of the particularities of Mill's socialism, the more significant observation is this. At the very moment the brightness of Mill's star as an iconic figure for American liberalism was dimming, amidst stories that seemed to imply that his arc towards socialism was not only happened much earlier in his career, but were also caused by a love affair with a woman, another English liberal, John Locke, who had no women in his life, nor any socialistic tendencies, was securing his place in the mind of many as the source of American liberalism and his so-called American liberal tradition. By the late 1930s, the historian Merrill Curdy had claimed Locke as America's philosopher. In the 1940s, Locke seemed the perfect counterweight to Mein Kampf. In the 1950s, Locke's ascent became meteoric as his ideas appeared to explain why Americans on the whole would never be taken in by Marxists. Locke's perceived long-standing influence on the Founding Fathers secured his place in an origin story of American politics. But it was the ease with which his writings on private property in the Second Treatise, combined with his defense of a religious-based toleration, could contrast to the ideas advanced by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital that guaranteed the longevity of his relevance. At Harvard University in the spring term of 1956, to cite just one example, the suggested paper topics for a core humanities course included the rationale for revolution, Locke and Marx, labor and property, Locke and Marx. Louis Hartz's famous The Liberal Tradition in America, published in 1955, used the pervasiveness of a Lockean spirit to account for how Marx and Engels could have been so wrong to predict socialism's eventual success in America. In the liberal tradition, Marx's name appears third most often, behind that of only Locke and Thomas Jefferson. Locke and Marx went hand in hand, one to counterbalance the other. Mill, by contrast, appears in the liberal tradition in passing, twice, in a 19th century English context. It's not that Mill and Marx were never paired, but when they were, as happened frequently in 1948, the centennial of the publication of Marx's Communist Manifesto and Mill's Political Economy, Mill fared rather poorly. Consider, for example, the University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman's position at the 8th annual meeting of the Economic History Association in September of 1948. At this meeting, commemorating the centennial of the two publications of Marx and Mill, Friedman offered the following assessment of the lasting influence of the two philosophers, Marx and Mill. If collectivism ultimately triumphs over individualism, Friedman cautioned his audience, it will be in no small measure a result of the influence of the ideas first popularized and made respectable by Mill. Friedman went on to note that, as he put it, Mill's doctrine of gradualism, of piecemeal and opportunistic intervention and reform subject to no general principles of appropriate state action, can lead to the almost unnoticed aggrandizement of the state and encroachment on political liberty. Mill was, for Friedman and many of his generation, more dangerous for America than Marx because perhaps what Mill was up to wasn't so obvious. 12 years later, in the early 1960s, when Henry Steele Commager reviewed the Columbia historian Bernard Wishy's momentous single volume of John Stuart Mill's Essays on Freedom, Prefaces to Liberty, he praised Wishy's work, but noted with respect to Mill that while Mill's basic arguments for freedom are still valid, they are inadequate. But was Mill really as irrelevant as the above might lead us to believe? Perhaps making a distinction between the reception of certain works of his on representative government, on liberty, and how the legacy of the man himself fared is useful in answering such a question. Even as Locke, becoming shorthand for the ideas expressed in the second treatise, came to fill a void left behind by Mill once his socialism and liberalism seemed irreconcilable, Mill's works did not completely disappear from discussions of American political identities. One work of his that has gone unmentioned thus far, on the subjection of women, for example, reemerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s as a rallying cry for many second-wave feminists across the country. But between the 1930s and 1950s, Mill's centrality in discussions of American liberalism as a tradition lessened. Because of the finer line he walked between what many saw as socialism and liberalism, while particular publications of his remained integral for those seeking to understand historical British or European political thought, Mill's more complex social liberalism prevented the philosopher from becoming Americanized in the same way as John Locke. Perhaps for some, it was easier to make a distinction between Marx and Locke than it was to unpack Mill. But by putting red flags around Mill, something was lost. Perhaps a willingness of the American political tradition to embrace a messier liberalism represented by Mill that at one time had seemed the very essence of political possibility in this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you. That was wonderful. Yes, thank you, Claire. And I thank also the organizers, and I'm so pleased to be a part of this wonderful tradition of conversation, which is it's so important that we all do. So I'm going to talk about the Scottish Enlightenment and its association with the United States Constitution. I understand why people might wonder why I'm talking about the Scottish Enlightenment, but I'm hoping that by the time I explain that the United States Constitution has very strong roots in the ideology and the philosophy and public philosophy of the Scottish Enlightenment, that you will suddenly want to study it more in depth, but I will give you some of it. So let's start with truly common ground, an instrument that we absolutely of all respect, and that is the United States Constitution. And I go to a constitutional law professor from University of Chicago for our first statement. That he says in his book, he talks a lot about why the Constitution is such an incredible document. But the thing he mentions that he thought was really the brilliance of it was the conversational demand of the Constitution, that it demands conversation between adversaries, which would seem that it would make it unstable, but in this contradiction, it's a moving document that can be stable. A severe document would not be able to be. So it is the document of the Constitution that forces our conversation, and Obama gave James Madison credit for that, who was the author of the Constitution. And I will say, and what I'm explaining today is that the reason he did this in his ideology that's reflected in the Constitution certainly comes from the writings of David Hume, and I'll try to make that case. But first, let's talk about James Madison. You might think immediately that, oh, he must have been a Scot, and he wasn't. Born in Virginia, and was not a Scot. He had an associate. One of his early tutors was a Scot. But he spent a lot of his formative years, his ideas, when his ideas were forming, he spent them at the best place besides Scotland that you could get the closest to Scotland. He never went to Scotland, he never met David Hume, but he did his undergraduate and his graduate work at Princeton University, which was at the time the College of New Jersey. The College of New Jersey at that time, one of only the 4 institutions of higher learning in the 13 colonies. The Princeton alumni were more represented at the Constitutional Convention than Yale or Harvard. It was a university that was very invested in the American Revolution, and this is where James Madison was. So let's look at why why I'm calling the Princeton University Scottish. I'm going to go to, there's lots of reasons, but I'm going to center on John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was the longest president to serve Princeton in its early years, and you can see that the years he served were right through the American Revolution. He encouraged, maybe really encouraged, everybody on the staff, everybody in the school to sign on to this American Revolution movement. He was a huge supporter of it. And his ideology was deeply seated in the Scottish Enlightenment. He was born and raised and educated in Scotland. He was an evangelical Presbyterian minister, but he believed that being a virtuous person or becoming virtuous or the development of virtue was absolutely open to everyone, no matter what their religious affiliation or with no religious affiliation. And this, and he believed that the Scottish Enlightenment writers, particularly he had an affinity towards Francis Hutchinson, Thomas Reid, and believed that morality could be understood in a common sense manner, and so could public policy also. And of course his student was James Madison, more so than just John Witherspoon being the president of the university and James Madison being a student. After James Madison graduated from Princeton, he continued to study with John Witherspoon. Now you could say, well, a lot of students disagree with their instructors. I know that personally. But in this case, the only thing, maybe the only disagreement, and I don't think it was a disagreement, that James Madison sort of leaned towards the David Hume writings, maybe more than the Hutchinson or Reid, but they were the entire curriculum of Princeton. Princeton today is a great Scottish spot. The Presbyterian Seminary is there. The Journal for Scottish Philosophy is there. Princeton is certainly, it is related and has its roots in the Scots. So, I have to go, excuse me here. So I just wanted to tell you that I'm not alone. So I grabbed Gary Wills from Northwestern and just said that he thinks this too. So so he also sees conversation demanded in the Constitution. He attributes it to James Madison, and then he attributes it to James Madison's reading of David Hume. So what's interesting is what Gary Wells is pointing out is that this instrument, this test of utility, was the heart of the Scots, particularly David Hume, who writes on, if it doesn't work, it's got to work. Something's got to work. It's got to make sense in order to do something or have a policy. It's got to be a policy that works. It has to be an institution that works. We need to be able to get along, and that's what David Hume, according to Gary Wills, influenced Madison's writing of the Constitution. I want to make one more connection. This doesn't involve the Constitution, but I have to throw it in there because I love Ben Franklin. And I just want to say that Ben Franklin and David Hume, James Madison never met David Hume, but Ben Franklin did. Now, Claire and I, we've been trying to remember where they met, and I thought it was in a parlor, an intellectual parlor in London. Or no, I thought it was France. You think it's in Edinburgh. And I'm not sure. Now I have to go back and dig this out. But intellectuals used to get together and talk. And I know it was under this type of a relationship that Ben Franklin met David Hume. I don't know a lot about the relationship. I was fortunate enough to, in the Edinburgh Library a number of years ago, I read Hume's papers. So interesting, of course. Hume's papers would have the letters that came from Ben Franklin, not the letters he sent. So I read a letter that was penned by Ben Franklin, and he was thanking Hume for his support of the revolution in the 13 colonies. But the most of the letter was Ben Franklin explaining to Hume how he could use the lightning rod to stop the fires that they were having in Edinburgh. I didn't look up the history of the time, but from reading the response, it seemed like Hume had said, could you give us a shot about this, these lightning rods? And it was just him explaining to him how he could use those. So this leads me to David Hume. And now I hope you're really interested in hearing what he had to say, who he was, because he influences your life today in the Constitution. David Hume was an empiricist. He believed that our knowledge comes from our experience, how we experience each other, how we experience other things. We learn through experience. We're born with the capability of knowledge, but with no knowledge. So that would be an empiricist. John Locke was an empiricist also. So he believed that we learn from experience, and he also had the same 18th century problem that everybody had during that time. For the 18th century philosophers, and this is the Scots along with David Hume, it was a little different when I take their moral theory. If you look at their moral theory, and I'm really simplifying the ancients and the medievalists, but they would look for, like, how does one have a good life? How does one have a flourishing life? The individual good life. How do you do that? And the switch in the early modern times, so we're talking 16 to 1800 when the Scots were writing, the biggest question to philosophers and the response they were making is, how are we going to get along? How the differences, how are we going to all be able to work together, and what do our institutions need to look like so that we can get along? And you think, well, why were they thinking about how we're going to get along? What were their challenges? Well, these challenges, the challenges of the 18th century are so alike the challenges we have today, because getting along became very difficult, particularly after this. We have, what's happening is the Protestant Reformation. This is preceding, of course, the Scots. So what have you got? You've got Lutheranism, Catholicism in Germany. You've got John Knox in Presbyterianism. You've got John Calvin. You've got all this upheaval, and we've got disagreement at a very basic personal level of belief systems. And that was the challenge being faced by the 18th century. And so, hence, this is another thing that's in our Constitution, and other people wrote of it. Hume was not the only one, but he writes quite emphatically that there has to be a separation of church and state. And if you can imagine what's going on, if the state is influenced by a certain denomination or church, and then you're of the other, Hume could see the atrocities and the horrible things that were happening. So he said, a government, if it's going to work, if it's going to make sure we can all get along, it cannot be affiliated with a religion. It has to be separate. And of course, James Madison made that fairly clear also in the Constitution. That was one thing that we may owe to Hume. The other thing is the size of government. David Hume was very concerned about mob decisions. Big groups of people swaying one way or the other on superficial items, not getting to the depth of the issue. We need to talk in depth. You can't talk in depth when you have 1,000 people. He uses actually the term. When 1,000 people are in a room, nothing good is going to come from that. They're not going to come up with any great understandings of each other. It's going to just flow. And so political groups, the actual decision makers for Hume, had to be in a size that could converse, could actually listen to each other, and this was really important. Let me say that this is an issue. What Hume is recognizing here is recognizing human nature. This is the other thing in the early modern era. It became very important that if you had anything that concerned any institution, any policies that concerned human beings, you had to know what you were dealing with. What are we by human nature? And him mentioning that we tend to just fly from one way to the other on superficial things if there's too many of us, what he said is that we need and this was not just Hume, this is Francis Hutchinson, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid. We need to know what human nature is all about. So another problem. This is another early modern problem. Thomas Hobbes, famous for everything we do because we care about ourselves. Every motivation is rooted in self-interest. When you have that going on, you've got a problem. And you need an overseer government that can punish you if you interfere with somebody else. So if you've got that human nature, and that's where Thomas Hobbes starts, and he says, this is what we need to solve it. Well, that was the beginning, but then we have the three Scottish Enlightened scholars, Francis Hutchinson, David Hume, and Adam Smith, says, we do have self-interest. There's no question we have self-interest. But we also have this thing called innate benevolence. Now, it may be really little, but it is there. How do they know that? Now we have to go back to what I said about David Hume. He's an empiricist. He experiences his own benevolence, and he experiences it in others, and he experiences that we value, and we think benevolence is such a good thing, and we value it in others, we value it in ourselves, and he believes it's a part of human nature. Francis Hutchinson will tell you that God gave that to us so we would get along. David Hume said it's part of our nature. We're born that way. He doesn't know how it got there. And Adam Smith also believed it was part of our nature, that we had this little gizmo of caring about others. It can be shrunk, and it can be expanded. So here's where we start. This is where we start with any public policy, with anything that the Scots would write about. Undergirding it always was, yes, of course we're all self-interested. There's no philosopher worth anything that wouldn't say we have self-interest. But we also have this thing, this interest in the welfare of others, even strangers. We care about strangers. We hear a story, a tear comes to our eye. We've never met the person. But then here's where we reach another commonality for the Scots. And that is that soon after birth, we realize that we need each other. We need each other in a real way. And I don't want to make this, I want this to realize that this is like through the Scots, this is really important that we need each other. And they're not talking about economics. Yes, I'll grow the tomatoes, I'll trade with you for the salary. I mean, of course we have that. We have all the different roles, but it's bigger than that. I don't even know myself without talking to another. I don't know myself. I can't function and develop my own humanity unless I'm in a society that works for me and for everybody else. And we care about that society, and we care about what's damaging to that society. And therein lies, again, I started with a commonality of the Constitution. Now I'm back to a commonality. Now we all may disagree about what's good for society, but that is where the commonality is for the Scots. And if we always deal with this, we know that the commonality is there, that we do care about society, we need society. Hume was almost satirically critical of somebody who isolates themselves and just thinks on their own and isolates and doesn't talk about their ideas. He would say that an idea isn't an idea unless it's communicated. And that's where you get better ideas. And sometimes we understand what we think only when we say it, and we discuss things with others. So this is where the commonality begins, and it is in the observations and relationships with others. We learn about each other and ourselves. Now, I could go on and on about this, but I'll spare you that I can't even know myself unless I see myself reflected in you. This is Adam Smith, and David Hume calls that others are a mirror to ourselves. We see ourselves, we understand ourselves because we are reflected back to us. And these interactions and conversations are so very important. So I hope you're seeing now that how this becomes an important part of the conversation of government, and how important it is that the Scots valued conversation in the development of humanity, in the development of morality, and in the development of governmental systems and how they are structured. So any governmental system needs to have that part. So the Scots recognized the need to continually readjust morality and government in response to the observations of the times. and in relationships with others throughout conversation. An examination of Hume's moral and political philosophy shows that the basis for morality in government necessitates openness of the times in relation to the effects of them on people and society in general. For Hume, the structure of society works only when it functions as a useful and important part of facilitating effective living with each other in community. Hume believed an idea worthwhile is only worthwhile when it can be communicated to, understood by others. Madison agreed and wrote a constitution that reflected that belief and commitment in its structural demand for conversation between opposing views. Thank you.
It's lovely to see that there's overlaps
I know.
between our talks. It's wonderful.
I know.
I just want to say thank you also to Howenstein and how important it is to have these conversations, that we have them in our normal lives in different ways. An example, I was sitting on a plane a couple weeks ago and coming back from Phoenix, and the man sitting next to me, who turned out to be a CPA who works for a major East Coast municipal supply, saw me pick up my book and start reading it. And it was a book on feminist philosophy by one of my students. And so that started one of those interesting but amicable plane conversations. And at one point he claimed that the government should adopt its policies based on a theory of rugged individualism. I asked him when and where that had ever worked in modern society and politics, and he said 100 years ago in the United States. So, I want to go back and look at 100 years ago in the United States. World War I was starting, and the hugely influential progressive era movement had just recently changed our political and social landscape. So here I'd like to explore why there was a need for the progressive movement and the philosophies and activism that grew out of that need, particularly in the work of Jane Addams and John Dewey, who were foundational figures in the progressive movement of the 1890s to 1920s. So Jane Addams, at the age of 29, she founded Hull House, which was one of the earliest and most successful American settlement houses. It was in the heart of the poverty-stricken immigrant district in Chicago, and this would be her home for the rest of her life. When she moved to Chicago in the 1890s, people were dying in the street due to starvation. She, at one point, tried to find the pavement. The children, the pictures of children playing with dead horses, they're playing on top of the garbage boxes. She tried to find the pavement under the street. She found the pavement 8 inches below the garbage that was just packed down on the street. So being Jane Addams, she decided she would become the garbage inspector. And so she applied for and became the garbage inspector, and here she is, this young woman from an upper class background, spent every morning driving around following the garbage inspectors, the people who picked up garbage, just to say, you must take care of this. Of course, that became politically awkward, and so they made a law that you had to take a civil service exam to be the garbage inspector, and only men could take the civil service exam, and so there she was. But in this era, there was such a corrupt municipal government based on political favors. And what we see is that there were not enough schools for the children. There were diseases such as cholera and typhoid were rampant and often spread by the sweatshop system. Addams herself actually founded the Visiting Nurse Association to try and combat some of this. Small children went to the factories at the age of 5. There was no 8-hour workday or child labor laws. Rich people were getting richer and poor people were getting poorer. There were few government regulations about workplace safety. There were monopolies. And here we know some of the stories of the Triangle factory with the people locked into the factories, couldn't get out even in a case of fire. And the children of Jane Addams' neighborhood really did suffer greatly, didn't go to school because they were in the factories. So this was a time of social Darwinism as well. And there was this misunderstanding. Darwin would have never appreciated this theory, but that it justified to some people that the survival of the wealthiest was the survival of the fittest, and the weakest should suffer and die out as a natural phenomenon. There were very few social service agencies, and people actually thought ethically this was a good thing for the human race. So although the industrial age of the late 1880s and early 1900s saw social unrest, economic inequalities, and harsh conditions for those in poverty, there was surprisingly also a sense of optimism, a belief, possibly inspired also by Darwinian thought, that this was a time of progress. So the pragmatist philosophy of Adams and Dewey developed in a time when the American experience was moving from a myth, a national myth of individualism, symbolized often by the American frontier and those who heroically explored it, to an awareness of the necessity of cooperation and social equality needed to live in a city environment. Adams and Dewey were both pragmatist philosophers and activists, although Adams, until recently, has been more known for her activism and Dewey for his philosophy, and they were the voices of the progressive reform. Pragmatist philosophy and progressivism affirm meliorism, which is the belief that we as humans can radically improve our world and that we have a responsibility to do so. Dewey is famous for saying that philosophy should be about solving the problems of humankind. And he really took that to heart, and so did Adams, of course. There's lots to say about both of them, but I'm going to talk mostly about their work about democracy and a few notes about educational reform. But first, a short introduction. Many of you probably know who Dewey and Adams are. John Dewey is referred to as the father of the progressive movement. This is particularly true for educational theory. He lived to be 92, so he was actually still alive when I was born, and for many decades was a preeminent American philosopher of the 20th century. He was also a commentator on culture and politics, and at times an activist. When he was first starting his career, he was a school teacher. He returned and got his PhD from Johns Hopkins, and then moved to the University of Michigan as a professor of philosophy, and later to the University of Chicago, which is where he met Adams. So the pragmatist philosophers, mostly William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, Jane Addams, are these foundational theorists of the school of pragmatism. Adams, with a group of talented women at Hull House, quickly became a force for industrial reform, for protection and education of children, advocacy for women's rights, support for the labor unions. It was also a center of arts and culture. Nearly every well-known person of that era seemed to have either stayed at Hull House or spoke at Hull House, and many times stayed for weeks or even months. In the early 20th century, Adams was revered and loved nationally and internationally. Polls in 1912 and 1913 showed her that Americans considered her one of the top 3 women of history and one of the most socially useful Americans, second only to Thomas Edison. Of course, public opinion changed radically due to her pacifism before and during World War I, when she was vilified by the media and by politicians. And here you have, after the Red Scare in 1922, in her work, she was seen as one of the most dangerous women of America. The Lusk Report was a report prepared in the Red Scare after the Bolshevik Revolution, trying to locate the dangerous and radical and socialist elements of our culture. If you see, like at the bottom where a lot of the lines go, those lines are going to the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which Jane Addams was the founder and president of for many years. It's still an organization that works with the UN on women's issues. Addams received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931 for her peace work. Adams and Dewey's commitment to social issues can be illustrated by the long list of progressive social reforms that they worked with. Women's suffrage, the American Civil Liberties Union, which they were founders of, the NAACP, which they were also founders of. For Dewey, he worked on the American Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky, Adams was deeply involved in international and national suffrage and peace movements. I one time made a list of all the organizations that Adams was part of. It took 2 pages just to make a list of all the things she was a board of director. It's like, how did she do all that? So Adams and Dewey really believed in democracy. It was a faith for them. It was a core idea they returned to over and over. For them, it wasn't just a political system. It was intellectually, socially, aesthetically, as well as politically, a standard that they held. It was an interactive and interdependent way of being in the world with others. They thought that the democracy of classical liberalism, with its focus on individualism as opposed to state control, was insufficient. Don't get me wrong, they believed that equal rights were important, but they were necessary, but not sufficient. They thought we had moved, or we either should move or had moved beyond thinking primarily about the individual to thinking about the common good. There's some place where we overlap here. So they thought democracy for Adams and for Dewey required that we must experience the lives of others, that we must mix on the common and thronged road to see the size of each other's burden. So as a mode of associated living, democracy understood in this way necessitates an egalitarian way of being together that values community decision-making. They were interested in the process of democracy, not just the politics of democracy. How do we live together and work together? It's obvious that democracy was not working in the poor immigrant districts in Chicago in the 1890s. Adams' experience of the extent of suffering could have caused her to abandon democracy as a viable political option. There were many socialists and anarchists who did just that in that time. But Adams begins her work with the assumption that the cure for democracy is more democracy. She didn't merely extend democracy, she radically recreated it. She took what had been an individualistic, political, liberal structure and recreated it as a mode of community association. Changes, she said, had to be made in social conditions to create the conditions for democracy. She said democracy had made little attempt to assert itself beyond the position of the 18th century leaders who believed that political equality alone would secure the good for all men. Later she points out, yes, here it is. Later she points out that these early leaders founded their new government on an involuntary reference to a lower social state and depended on penalties, coercion, compulsion, and remnants of the military code to hold the community together. So she's actually taking this a step further. She doesn't talk in this tone very often. She's more focused on how can we live together in a way that is useful. This, what Adams calls the newer concept of democracy, grows out of shared experiences. Beyond individual standards of right and wrong, this newer social ethic requires one to make decisions based on the community good only after experiencing others' lives. These common experiences require dialogue, again, conversation, and participation in addressing social concerns. Even in industry, she advocated for decisions based on dialogue and mutuality. She was a member of several labor negotiation committees in Chicago, including the Pullman rail strike. And she said in that case and in many cases, the employer is often cut off from social ethics when he is good to people rather than with them, when he decides what's best for them without consulting them. Adams also critiqued how capitalism distorts democracy. She said the great principle of liberty has been translated into the unlovely doctrine of commercial capitalism, perhaps seeing the warning signs of global capitalism that rides often on the coattails of democratic reform. She also connected laissez-faire capitalism with imperialism and militarism, saying that unrestricted commercialism is an excellent preparation for government aggression. You can probably see why she was seen as a radical. So So for Dewey and Adams, they thought that democracy and education were completely tied together. Dewey said, democracy has to be born again in each generation, and education is its midwife. And for Dewey and for Adams, those two ideas were so intertwined. Education remains a hotly contested issue between progressive and conservative thinkers because education is one of the areas where social change does happen. And we are still arguing about Dewey and Adams in relationship to education. One of my neighbors told me that Dewey was the reason, the cause of everything that's wrong with education today. Well, at least he knew who Dewey was, right? Yeah. So mirroring other conditions, education was in a state of crisis when Adams and Dewey started pursuing educational reform. The previous politics had seen vigorous debates over the role of the state in the education of children. Many people felt that state-funded education should be limited to reading, writing, spelling, and common arithmetic. All other education, these advocates thought, should be left to parents. The fight for free high school education had been won by 1890, but the quality of education was generally very bad. Managers and administrators were mostly incompetent, as school administration positions were often given as political favors, just like being the garbage collector. Joseph Mayer Rice's 1990 series of critical articles concerning the condition of schools created an outcry throughout the country. Rice's investigation found that in city after city, public interference, corruption, and incompetence were conspiring to ruin schools. With alarming frequency, the story was the same. Political hacks hiring untrained teachers who blindly led their innocent charges in sing-song drill, rote reputation, and meaningless verbiage. Adams served on the ad hoc school committee after the Rice articles came out, trying to think about educational reform. Adams thought, as well as Dewey, that education could make social change possible. As Jacob Rees, author of the powerful book, How the Other Half Lives, asks, do you not see how the whole battle with Islam is fought in and around the public schools? So what to do? So Dewey, when he was in Chicago, his children became school age, and he started thinking much more intently about what needs to happen in schools. And he began to think about education instead of rote repeating and memorization, but rather through experimental and experiential learning. So he started the lab school. It actually was called the University Elementary School at the University of Chicago, but is more commonly known as the lab school, based on student-engaged education, where students explore learning through hands-on practice. It's interesting, I read recently that Obama's children, when they lived in Chicago, attended the lab school, so that it's interesting. I actually didn't realize it was still going on. Adams' educational work, so here's the lab school, the kids working with modeling. Here they are again, and you see all the writing on the walls, but the kids are doing very active things. Adams, too, she's mostly known for community education, and she started the Labor Museum, which preserved the ways of a museum plus a learning institution. So it preserved the methods of labor of past generations, and it taught people to value the labor of their parents and grandparents. But it also taught them how to blend their industrial lives with the history and culture of the past. And Adams she was such a liberal arts advocate. Her education had changed her life. Reading the great thinkers of the past, the visionary people the philosophers that she modeled her life on, she was such an advocate of liberal arts. but she also really despaired of a liberal arts type of education that ignored the needs of the industrial workers. So she tried to figure out a way to blend those two. And she did that in many ways. She had at Hull House, she started out with reading groups, they had lecture groups. Dewey came in and lectured at Hull House, very involved in intellectual community, but also they had labor union meetings there. They had a lot of the activities that caused social reform started at Hull House. So while interest in education and social reform flourished in the progressive era, the fear surrounding World War I and the subsequent Red Scare brought a halt to many of the reformers. Certainly, there was no longer the sense that the world was progressing to a better place, beyond militarism and towards equality. Adams used to think that we had moved beyond war. Yet I think that today progressives and conservatives would both agree that the reforms that Dewey and Adams worked on, women's suffrage, child labor laws, education reform, industrial safety, were reforms that were necessary. And contrary to the CPN in the plane last month, I suspect that few educated people who lived in those conditions of that era would want to return our country to that state. In these ways, the progressive era changed our culture, and Dewey and Adams set the conditions for some of the ongoing debates we still have about progressive and constructive and conservative education and democracy. Thank you.
Very good.
Time for questions, 10 minutes or so, and where perhaps you see the overlap between these two or other questions that you have.
Thank you all for your presentations. I had a question, I suppose, most directly for Professor Vandenberg, but you can all jump in if you want. You talked about how the Scottish Enlightenment was trying to find some basis for common ground in the wake of the Reformation. Christianity could no longer provide it. And so they tried to construct a philosophy of human nature, because they still believed that constitution society must be based on some common understanding of human nature. Over the last 200 years, any common understanding of human nature, Scottish or otherwise, has been largely kind of deconstructed by modern philosophy, and the idea of affirming or asserting a common human nature is as oppressive as asserting or affirming a common faith or anything. So, could you comment on the future of common ground or constitutional government once this foundation that, say, the Scots believed was necessary, a common understanding of human nature, once that's really no longer available to us intellectually?
Oh, I think it is available to us. I think that there is a base. There is a human nature. I mean, we have to go right to the basics. That what hurts me, what hurts me physically, for instance, if I get hit or something, there's a certain we have more common human nature than we have differences. The differences have expanded, absolutely, but there is the common, and the way we learn about our commonality is in conversations with others. What hurts me, what hurts you. If you meet somebody, let me give you an example. Hume gives this example that you think that there's all kinds of different people all in different cultures. He said, but you can pick any place on the planet, anywhere to go, and if you go to a funeral there, and you can understand the language, you will never hear somebody stand up and say, this was such a good person. He beat his wife. He was horrible to his kids. He'd borrow stuff and never give it back. He was just, we were all afraid of him. This was such a good person. We're going to miss him so. And you'll never hear, well, glad this guy's gone. What a jerk. He was kind to everyone he met. He was a benevolent man. When you needed him, he was there for you. If you take this commonality and start right there, we've got something. And there's many more. That's just, so there are some commonalities. And those are the emphasis. What we've been emphasizing too much is the differences. But when we can get back to what we all agree on, I think that we can learn a lot about each other. Anybody else have anything?
While listening to these papers, I was thinking about possible connections between Claire's paper and Peggy's, and it occurred to me that Mill's intense engagement with the Scottish Enlightenment was particularly manifest in two texts, his examination of the philosophy of William Hamilton in 1865 and his great St. Andrew's Address in 1867. And what particularly interests me about them in relation to Claire's presentation is that these two texts are extensively cited throughout the 1870s and early 1880s by American secularists. These are people who are less concerned with political economy and with representative government, but are very concerned about the legacy of Christianity as a force in modern culture, and especially with the St. Andrew's Address. Mill sets forth a cultural program for modernity based on evidence and reasoning and empirical science, and allies himself very much with the sort of stuff that Huxley and Tyndall were doing at the time. I wonder whether or not that particular thread in Millian thought had something to do with the ups and downs of his reputation that you described. I should also say that Franklin met Hume in 1771 when he's a house guest of Hume in Edinburgh.
He was there.
Yeah.
See here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. So I think this maybe speaks to all. Maybe I'll start. I think what's really interesting, this actually brings Princeton back in. So absolutely, I think that one of the things that's really interesting about Mill is that because he is such a complex thinker, and he basically thinks about, philosophizes, writes about everything, to look at what different strands of Mill's thought are picked up at different times and pushed aside or incorporated into different Americans' understanding of themselves. And I think your point about Mill's engagement with Scottish thinkers in the 19th century is in fact something that's taught also to a great extent at places like Princeton by Scots like James McCosh. So I think understanding the strength of a certain kind of transatlantic connection in the 19th century, not only between Mill and his American correspondents, William James and others, and we have to remember that Mill is a very live and active presence in Americans' lives in the 19th century in a way that someone like Locke, obviously in the 19th century, is long dead, isn't. And so thinking about the very deep engagement with Mill in the 19th century that I think in some ways changes quite dramatically once Americans themselves are no longer actually engaging with Mill in person in their correspondence. But I think I'm going to have to think more about the sort of the extent to which this is actually also explains some of the sort of ebbs and flows, I think, as you put it, or the ups and downs. I think that's a really thoughtful, sort of thoughtful way to ponder some of Mill's, the sort of intricacies of Mill's reception.
Anything? No,
the Harvard historian James Kloppenberg has written this book called Reading Obama, and he analyzes Obama when Obama was the editor of the Law Review, and his writings probably Dreams of My Father more than his campaign treatise. Yes. But and he makes the argument that the president is that his political philosophy is that of a philosophical pragmatist in the tradition of Dewey and James, and I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yes, there are many actually pragmatists who write about how Obama actually is a pragmatist. I am not as deeply knowledgeable about Obama's political philosophies. It sounds like you are, but certainly this conception of politics and the role of politics in making social change and making the world a more equal and fair place, that it's not just about running the certain elements of the country, but that politics should be about change and should be about engaging with the people and the understanding of the people and the dialogue with the people. We would find that in terms of Obama and the pragmatists. Whether Obama himself ever said he was a pragmatist or talked about Dewey, I really don't know if he did. I do have a colleague who's written a book on that, and I haven't read it. So maybe I will go read it this summer. Thank you for that. I think the pragmatists were more radical than they're given credit to be, because Adams is often seen as this nice, benevolent person, but they really rethought what it meant to be an individual. And in relationship to Hume, I mean, that the individual is only constituted by the community, that there is no individual without the community. So it's an interesting connection between the three of our talks. Yeah.
I don't know whether he would be or not. Interesting. Thank you.
Looks like we are close to out of time. If there's one more question.